Well, welcome everybody to today's MSDI seminar. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land we're assembling on today. I'm on Wurundjeri country, people of the Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and indeed all the traditional owners of the lands where people are assembling today. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Aaron Jenkins, who is a Senior Research Fellow in Planetary Health at the University of Sydney and Edith Cowan University. Aaron is an ecologist and an epidemiologist. If we were to define his work through the lens of a single academic discipline, it would probably be eco-epidemiology, bringing ecology and epidemiology together. Aaron was raised in PNG and spent much of his childhood living in village communities with his shoes off. He moved to the US to train in ecology at Cornell University and marine biology in Woods Hole. After this, he returned to the Pacific to live in Fiji and work with the civil society organisation Wetlands International. He spent more than 10 years in Fiji building a substantial program on community management of aquatic ecosystems across the region, funded from philanthropic and development sources. In 2013, he changed direction a bit in his career. He moved to Perth to undertake a PhD connecting that previous work to human health outcomes. And the focus of his PhD was the eco-epidemiology of typhoid in Fiji. In 2017, he joined me when I was based at the University of Sydney as our first research fellow in planetary health, where he helped establish the WISH program, Watershed Interventions for Systems Health, which he now co-leads. Today, Aaron's going to tell us about this work in the context of the Pacific-led Tadra Vanua initiative. So welcome, Aaron, and over to you.
Thanks, Tony. So firstly, we're going to hear some from Donald Wilson from Fiji National University, who had hoped to be with us here today, but because he's a bit unwell, he's provided a recording of these brief opening remarks. So let me just get those going for you. Right, here we go.
Bulavanaka, everyone, and warm greetings from Fiji. I am Dr. Donald Wilson, the Associate Dean for Research at the College of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at the Fiji National University. I apologize for the stuffy nose. I've got a bit of a flu, and I'll just turn my video off. I apologize because we've had a bit of network issues even while recording this morning. So if you don't mind, I'll turn my video off. Very warm welcome to today's forum on our burgeoning overarching vision to provide an institutional home and nexus for the various One Health and Planetary Health initiatives being implemented in Fiji and the region. We are calling this vision Tadra Vanua, the etymology of which will be explained shortly. We in the Pacific believe that the region is now at a stage of development where it can offer an unparalleled research environment to help identify the integrative solutions required to ensure both the environmental and social well-being of its people, and with relevance to the entire planet. Most importantly, the Tadra Vanua initiative is a growing action research hub led by the Pacific for the benefit of the region and the planet. This not only requires a consolidated long-term vision, but also sufficient funding to drive a truly transformative action research agenda. We're building upon our existing relevant investments by both global philanthropic bodies and development aid agencies in the region, and continue to host two of the largest planetary health research programs in the region. The WISH and the RISE programs. Drawing on our existing strengths and partnerships, Tadra Vanua will champion the emergent fields at the nexus of health and our shared environment and deliver forward-thinking socio-ecological approaches to the Pacific health research and action through partnerships that meet the needs and objectives of Pacific Island governments and local communities. We at the Fiji Institute of Pacific Health Research and FNU are now poised to provide this institutional home for Tadra Vanua and seek suitable co-investment, co-design and collaboration on this timely initiative. As our oceanic peoples used meticulous observation of the elements, trial and error, commitment, determination, and innovation to design vessels that could journey out into the unknown, we now also need deep vision and courage to visualize new ways to connect us with and beyond our current horizons to collectively address the health of our region and planet. Again, I welcome you to this important forum. Vinaka Wakaleu and best wishes to you all. Vinaka.
Bula Vinaka, ladies and gentlemen. I'm greeting you in the Fijian language as this growing initiative for Pacific public and planetary health action research is building upon a platform of work arising from Fiji that I and many others have been involved now for almost 2 decades. I'm a proud Fijian citizen, and I've spent most of my life living and working in the Pacific Islands, as Tony has said. I'm very pleased to be here today to present to you progress towards the establishment of Tadra Vanua, a world-class, action-oriented, place-based, interdisciplinary research hub that aligns with the aspirations of Pacific Islanders and the urgent global need for integrative solutions for future health and well-being. My name is Aaron Jenkins, or Eroni in Fijian, and I'm an eco-epidemiologist and senior research fellow in planetary health with University of Sydney School of Public Health, Edith Cowan University's newly formed Centre for People, Place and Planet, and the Fiji Centre for Communicable Disease Control. So in recognition of both people and place, I respectfully acknowledge the past, present and future traditional custodians of the land on which we stand, the people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within Aboriginal custodianship of country. So to ground us from the outset on the path that this presentation will take, we'll begin by explaining the etymology of Tadra Vanua, followed by a brief description of the environmental, cultural, and public health context of the Oceanic Pacific, then highlight some origins of this initiative, the current foundational programs of research, including the large ongoing WISH and RISE programs, the enabling policy contexts, the global and regional networks that are becoming increasingly supportive of this vision, and conclude with a scan of the horizon, highlighting the next phase initiatives, objectives, and the large funding opportunities that will help shape this initiative and the region. So what is Tadra Vanua and what does it mean? Tadra is the Fijian word for dream, to dream of, or a visionary scheme. Vanua is a very important word in the Indo-Pacific context that derives from a Proto-Austronesian word, Vanua, meaning land, home, or village. Many forms of the word are found throughout Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines with a similar meaning, but here I'm focused on the Oceania context. In much of Oceania, the various forms of the word are an essential concept in Indigenous culture and society, where it means the people, their traditions and customs, beliefs and values, and the various other institutions established for the sake of achieving harmony, solidarity, and prosperity within a particular social context. It provides a sense of identity and belonging, where the Vanua is an extension of the concept of the self. So an Indigenous person from Oceania is thus defined through his or her land. This is as true for Pacific Islanders as it is for other Indigenous peoples of Oceania, such as Australian Aboriginals and the New Zealand Maori. The importance in the context of this initiative is that it's an Oceania-wide term, acknowledging that material, biological, social, and cultural dimensions are inextricably interrelated, and it's a recognized place-centered model for health and well-being. So this place that we speak of, it's often referred to as the liquid continent, It's Oceania, a vast area of some 156 million square kilometers, or almost a third of the Earth's surface. This is Vanua for 41 million people across Australasia, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia that call this region home. And we share interdependent relationships with the unfathomable number of species in this place. Pacific Islanders recognize ocean as a dynamic realm. It's the great source for all of humanity and all species on Earth. Oceans are the primary drivers of the Earth's climatic system, so this region provides a central context for new perspectives on human health and interspecies equity that place people as part of nature rather than the controlling influence over it. There's also a strong sense of intergenerational equity, where Pacific peoples have strong aspirations to make sure that these places will provide enough resources to enable cultural practice for their children and grandchildren. Oceania possesses globally important and unique natural and cultural diversity, supporting one of the richest complexes of terrestrial and marine ecosystems on Earth and among the world's most diverse range of indigenous cultures. Papua New Guinea alone is home to about a sixth of the world's languages, about 832 distinct vernaculars. Oceania has more than 1,000. This vast oceanic region thus has the most to lose, culturally speaking, from the pressures of global political and economic change. Yet these landscapes and seascapes that support health and well-being, culture and economies are delicate and rapidly transforming, reducing resilience to both environmental and climatic change. Continued habitat loss and degradation, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, and a changing climate are undermining ecosystem functionality and service provision in these island ecosystems. The primary health threats in the region relate both directly and indirectly to these rapidly changing socio-ecological settings, particularly infectious diseases related to water pollution and poor sanitation, and zoonotic diseases related to large numbers of subsistence livestock animals and informal animal husbandry practices. The urban transition is also central to the non-communicable disease crisis, with obesity and diabetes rising disproportionately faster in the Pacific region over the past 3 decades than in the rest of the world. So in a quick potted history of the program of work that has led to this point, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation funded about 6 years of our work beginning in 2006, which became known as the Ecosystem-Based Management Fiji Project. In this phase, we tried to understand the main threats to linked watershed and reef systems in the context of designing ridge-to-reef management for conservation and food and water security outcomes. This led to Fiji's first ridge-to-reef management plan and a much better understanding of the ecosystem connectivity across habitats and the establishment of multiple locally managed areas across reef, estuarine, and river sites and forests. It also helped propagate this notion of ecosystem-based management, which is now a well-established term in the sustainability discourse. In 2011, we became involved with an interdisciplinary team of researchers and practitioners under the banner of Wildlife Conservation Society's HEAL, Health and Ecosystems Analysis of Linkages program. This initiative morphed into what is now known as the Planetary Health Alliance. And around this time, we produced this model of how the combined effects of watershed modification and more intense cyclones and heavy rains are creating this perfect storm of conditions that leads to outbreaks of water-related disease and negatively affects human well-being through a combined impact on food and water resources. So we tried pitching this idea to a consortium of donors to address these issues in order to promote more integrated management to plan for multiple co-benefits. Unfortunately, we didn't receive funding at the time, but I decided that this was too important to let lie, and I went off to do a PhD at Edith Cowan University to study this problem. So in short, our Fiji studies and those of our colleagues showed amplified typhoid and leptospirosis disease associated with vegetation removal and erosion in watersheds, proximity to flooded areas, and also livestock. Upstream watershed conditions in rural areas also predict childhood diarrheal disease. Evidence to guide both natural and built infrastructure interventions in watersheds is therefore critical for water and sanitation management, as well as other downstream ecosystem services such as flood mitigation during adverse weather events. In February of 2016, Cyclone Winston caused massive damage to drinking water and sanitation infrastructure and to watershed systems in Fiji, with several outbreaks of typhoid and leptospirosis in the months to follow. The coordination and prioritization of response was hampered by this lack of integrated health, sanitation, and water quality information. So with some funding from and support from WHO and UNICEF, I helped to work with the Fijian government to start a system which could integrate drinking water quality and sanitation facility monitoring with health risk surveillance systems to enhance this recovery and response. And this began well, and it generated some really good intersectoral willingness to coordinate information, but it kind of petered out as the cyclone response funding dwindled. And soon afterwards, with the generous support of Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Bloomberg Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and some additional funding from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're able to tie together these various threads of work into what has become known as the WISH project, or the Watershed Interventions for System Health program. And here I just wanted to say that both of the large WISH and RISE, the Revitalizing Informal Settlements and Their Environments programs, are continuing to be hosted by the new Fiji Institute of Pacific Health Research, which have agreed to provide an institutional home for the Tadra Vanua and a nexus for the various One Health and Planetary Health projects being implemented in Fiji and the region. So the primary aims of WISH in this context are to empower communities to access and maintain their fundamental right to clean water, to develop coordinated mechanisms for systems health governance between communities and governments and across sectors, to strengthen the connections to place, to enhance environmental stewardship and maintain cultural practice, and reduce the incidence of water-related disease in people and downstream coral systems in 5 watersheds in Fiji, and to facilitate approaches to sustainably finance and scale these interventions nationally and regionally. As a way to engage with this complexity, in which we conceptualize natural systems as nested subsystems, there are risk presence and opportunities to act within each nested and connected subsystem, from the global climate system to environmental and social contexts, residential settings, and individual behaviors, to organs and unicellular organisms and genetic mobile elements that work together to regulate health. And interactions between the scales and systems ecology are considered as remembering for downscale interactions that draw on the biotic legacies of large, slow processes like forest assembly, for example, and revolt for the upscale connections from smaller scale, faster processes, such as microbially mediated disease outbreaks. And we must recognize that watersheds, also known as river basins and catchments, they're effective place-based functional units that offer a coherent and ecologically representative subsystem in which to address multiple environmental, socioeconomic, and health objectives together linked to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So in Fiji, in WISH, we're specifically tackling the most insidious and widespread of the water-related diseases that Pacific Island countries often refer to as the 3 plagues: leptospirosis, typhoid, and dengue. The Western Pacific region is estimated to have by far the highest global incidence of leptospirosis and typhoid, and the second highest incidence of dengue after Southeast Asia. Despite the sustained efforts to control water-related diseases, interventions that focus exclusively on the human disease and ignore the greater environmental and social context have been unsuccessful. Integrated systems that evaluate and address water-related disease risk by combining metrics of health, water safety, sanitation, and land use are really poorly studied, and they highlight this crucial need for research for creative solutions at this land, water, and health nexus. So our project is focused on 5 watersheds in 29 rural communities with high burdens of at least 2 of the 3 plagues. This is a participatory mixed methods action research, and it includes both quantitative and qualitative co-production of knowledge along key local stakeholders in iterative cycles of planning, implementation, and evaluation. And we're using the before and after design to evaluate health and health system outcomes, water quality, as well as social and downstream ecosystem impacts such as coral disease. At the national level, we're working with key stakeholders in both study design and implementation. And within the local intervention sites, we're working with communities using participatory approaches and the data gathered to guide the design of site-specific interventions. A massive amount of data is collected to evaluate health and health system outcomes, including the effectiveness of cross-sectoral and cross-scale processes, water quality, and social and ecosystem impacts within and downstream of the intervention watersheds, such as coral disease, and also abundance of food fishes. Ultimately, we've enrolled a total of 311 households in 29 communities across the 5 subcatchments in our action research. And this is one of our study villages in the Upper Vanua river system. We have a large team of around 17 in the field that presented all of our data back to the 29 villages. And based on this data and local knowledge, water safety and security plans are drawn up for each village, and the specific nature of the local interventions are determined in consultation with the village committees. These are a combination of both built and natural infrastructural interventions to reduce common drivers of water-related and coral disease spread, and also the decline of freshwater and marine food resources. Here you can see in this risk factor table the different nested scales at which risks for systems health are acting and where they're common for multiple diseases, including leptospirosis, typhoid, dengue, and coral disease. You can see there are clear efficiencies to be gained by acting on the risks at multiple scales, and there are risks and where risks are common to multiple diseases. So here we can modify environmental risks at a number of scales nested within watersheds and be addressing multiple outbreak-prone diseases and downstream ecosystem health. So a total of 220 interventions have been identified across all 29 communities from this place-based participatory process, including several that were identified after the multiple cyclones that went through. And you can see the widespread of general categories, with water supply improvement and protection is the most commonly identified, followed by agricultural practice improvement, drainage, waste management, livestock management, sanitation, and then health, riverbank stabilization, and a few issues to do with forestry, fisheries, fire, and aquaculture. So there's a very wide spread of interventions, mainly outside the purview of health systems. Fiji has been through 5 cyclones since April 2019, which has caused widespread flooding, damage to infrastructure, including many of the water and sanitation facilities, and distress to people and animals who are often crowded into these evacuation centres, even while the government is trying to enforce social distancing and hygiene. And our primary support here has been for our team to provide a series of training courses for the health inspectors, in particular on how to use and maintain portable labs that were purchased by WHO and UNICEF to test water quality in the remote affected areas. And also after the recent volcano in Tonga, we provided support to test the acidity of water supplies affected by the falling ash. Our interventions are now well underway in all of the watersheds, and in the communities that were most affected by the cyclones, we've prioritized making sure that they have a good supply of quality water. And where an old dam was washed away, for example, in one of our watersheds, we worked with the community to construct a new improved dam, seen here in a recent article in the Fiji Times. During the height of the COVID lockdown in Fiji, the first one, we provided several avenues of support to government and our 29 communities. Our project manager at the time, Dr. Rachel Devi, seen here in the upper left hand, was seconded upon request by government to provide full-time support and technical inputs to Fiji's COVID response team. And as part of our role in the Fiji Wash Cluster, we also helped government distribute hygiene packs to all of our communities And as part of this, our team also delivered boxes of sanitary napkins, specifically for the women and girls who had difficulty meeting this basic hygiene need during lockdown in remote rural areas. I wanted to also highlight the great and very challenging work being done by my friend and colleague, Mr. Suliasi Batikawai, the Fiji WASH Cluster Coordinator for Emergency and Disaster Response, and the National WASH Coordinator for the Ministry of Health and Medical Services in Fiji, and his recent recognition by the Indo-Pacific Centre for Health Security as a health security hero. He will be enrolling this year in postgrad degree shortly with one of our WISH affiliated institutions. So to facilitate the cross-sectoral governance, we've undertaken a review of policies, statutory and regulatory frameworks that govern both watershed management and human health in Fiji. And from this, we're preparing a policy brief that seeks to provide policymakers with a rationale for implementing an integrated intersectoral approach to watershed management for systems health. And it identifies issues with current policy and practice and provides recommendations for improvement. And we also work with the WASH cluster, and we've also prepared a cabinet paper, which is now sitting with the Attorney General's office to mandate interagency data sharing and response in relation to drinking water quality in particular. This involves, among other things, an integrated information management system on drinking water quality, sanitation assessment, and water-related disease surveillance, which we're trying to demonstrate with our project. It'll also support the development of an interagency rapid response team for public health emergencies related to water quality, sanitation, and water-related disease outbreaks. In all of this, it's important to recognize the critical importance of nature conservation as a public health intervention. As part of WISH Fiji, we've partnered with several conservation NGOs, and one of the great outcomes has been the commitment by communities within one of our watersheds to establish a large forest reserve, which is seen here on the islands of Overlau, protecting the headwaters serving all of the downstream communities. We're working on getting similar commitments across all of our catchments. Several recent studies demonstrate that the proximity to and the coverage of protected areas is associated with a decreased incidence of diarrhea, typhoid, and acute respiratory infection. And children living proximal to protected areas have a higher weight for age scores and are less likely to be stunted. However, perhaps one of the most important and compelling narratives here is that such nature conservation approaches are undoubtedly the most cost-effective and efficient means of preventing the next pandemic. The importance of nature conservation for pandemic prevention, as well as to achieve a multitude of public health and well-being outcomes, is obvious. It's surprising how slow this narrative is in gaining traction given the global circumstances. Okay, some interesting recent papers from the team. Our first PhD student to graduate from WISH earlier this year, Dr. Sarah Nelson from New Zealand, published several papers, one of which came out earlier this year, which examined whether seasonality and rainfall predict reported syndromes associated with lepto, typhoid, and dengue in Fiji. Poisson generalized linear models were fitted with early warning alert and response system syndromic data. So this is the EWARS system from March 2016 until December 2020, incorporating the seasonality, temperature, and rainfall. And in short, each EWARS syndrome and condition case peak is associated with different rainfall lag, varying between 0 and 11 weeks. This relationship between syndromes, rainfall, and seasonality show that it's possible to predict when outbreaks will likely occur by following the seasonality and rainfall patterns. Pre-positioning of diagnostic and treatment resources can then be aligned with spatially explicit seasonality and rainfall peaks to plan and address water-related disease outbreaks. In a study soon to come out, we augmented this epidemiological surveillance and Bayesian phylogenomic approaches with a multi-year typhoid case control study to define geospatial patterns among typhoid cases. This figure shows the population dynamics of a typhoid fever in Central Division Fiji. So figure A is a phylogeny of 2,700 S typhoid genomes. B shows the temporal population structure of 2 Fijian endemic genotypes. C shows the distribution of the 2 major Fijian genotypes. And D shows the Bayesian population dynamics with genetic diversity on the y-axis, which is proportional to infected population size. The arrows indicate waves of genetic expansion and contraction over time, with the cyclone icons showing Cyclone Damon in 2007, Cyclone Thomas in 2010, and Cyclone Evan in 2012. And what we see here is that cyclones and flooding drive waves of typhoid outbreaks in Fiji, which through population aggregation, poor sanitation and water safety, and then mobility of the population, spread these clones more widely. It's now tempting to speculate that increased cyclonic intensity driven by climate change is accelerating the evolution of Salmonella typhi in Fiji, and very likely many of the other waterborne pathogens. Nested within the WISH Fiji project and building from our previous work on typhoid in Central Division, we also have a consortium of researchers who received 3 of the 10 globally awarded Gates Grand Challenge grants to work on better understanding the environmental niches of Salmonella typhi. In short, we know that watersheds impacted by anthropogenic activity result in soil erosion, high sediment yields, and elevated nutrient availability in rivers. And this is associated with high typhoid fever incidence. So we hypothesize that sediment-associated biofilms are an important ecological niche for S. typhi survival. And we see that in sediment biofilm communities, a common co-occurrence between the soil amoeba Acanthamoeba and S. enterica. Experimentally, we see that in the presence of this amoeba, which forms cysts, that in water, typhoid is still alive after 500 days. Some of the bacteria are free, and you can see that in the red arrow at the top of the picture there. And some of the bacteria seem associated with the cyst, which you can see with the white arrow, while other bacteria seem to be located inside the cyst, which is the green. We also found that typhoid genomes, they rearrange their structure in water, with the most common arrangement being GS 11.1. So we also had the opportunity to look at the diversity of genome structures present in a collection of clinical isolates obtained between 2016 and 2020 in Fiji, largely isolated and extracted by our senior lab technician, Mr. Uraya Rambuatoka at Fiji Institute of Pacific Health Research. Using a combination of long and short read sequencing, we identified several different structures, including 2 isolates with GS 11.1, seen circled here. Taken together with our other findings, we hypothesized that if clinical strains in this GS 11.1 arrangement are shed into watercourses where soil amoeba are present, they're highly likely to persist and contribute to further transmission. So we have been called upon by the Gates Foundation to submit a second phase grant for this work. Our research also extends to the recognition that place attachment is a fundamental driver of well-being for Pacific Islanders, but also that it's not well considered in the design of management or sustainable development programs. So this paper was presented by my colleague Stacey Jupiter at the Ocean Sciences meeting earlier this month. Building on a variety of studies, the group developed guidance materials for how one might start to go about co-developing culturally attuned monitoring and reporting indicators. And these materials can be found using the link provided here. We also have been trying to feed the recommendations to recognize the components of place attachments within the various M&E systems across the Pacific. For example, through our engagement with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, we're able to ensure that the pillars of Indigenous knowledge and Pacific worldviews are incorporated prominently in the Pacific Resilience Standards, which is being used to monitor the progress against the framework for resilient development in the Pacific. It's an important regional policy framework that guides climate-smart, sustainable development. I have to say, we're very pleased to learn that WISH Fiji was also selected in 2020 as one of the 10 projects worldwide demonstrating planetary health in practice, to feature in a new anthology of case studies published by the Planetary Health Alliance. Ours is case study number 6, seen here. It also has a good teaching guide that accompanies each case study. So it's a very useful resource that we're trying to build into planetary health courses here in both Australia and in the US, and we're intending to use at Fiji National University as well. And it's well worth a look. Which has also just been selected last week for acceleration by the Blue Climate Initiative, and will be among a select number of projects to form the heart of the program for the Blue Climate Summit, held from 14th to 20th of May next month in French Polynesia, which is going to benefit from the attention, creativity, and resources of a remarkable group of scientists, activists, entrepreneurs, investors, and leaders, with the objective to catalyze, accelerate, and scale impact. It's important that we understand the policy context into which we are growing Tadra Vanua. Tadra Vanua is rooted in this unifying Healthy Islands vision for Pacific Island countries, which was declared at the first Pacific Health Ministers meeting 27 years ago on Vanua Island, Fiji, and it still resonates today. The vision of healthy islands as places where, and you can see the characteristics here, but central to this understanding of healthy islands is the sense of its ownership by the Pacific, and that it's unique to the Pacific. It's synonymous with a place-based or settings approach to health promotion, and its practical expression in healthy cities, healthy villages, healthy schools, and healthy marketplaces. With a concerted push for Pacific regionalization and self-determined development, Tadra Vanua is going to help support the implementation of the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. And underpinning this strategy is the Blue Pacific narrative, which forum leaders endorsed in 2017, which sees this region as a large oceanic continent, the blue continent. And it's important in flipping a colonial reinforced vulnerability narrative of small island developing states to one of resilient and self-determined large ocean states. After all, the Pacific Island countries manage 20% of the world's ocean in their exclusive economic zones. The forum officials subcommittee to implement this is chaired by Fiji and Vanuatu. Tadra Vanua will also importantly assist in providing a guidance to implement the WHO Manifesto for Healthy and Green Recovery from COVID-19 with specific recommendations for the region. The Research Hub will also provide ongoing advice to the WHO Technical Advisory Group for Environment, Climate and Health, which is chaired globally from the Fiji office and also has members within our Centre for People, Place and Planet Advisory Committee. Tadra Vanua is responding directly to an urgent mandate from recent global and regional fora for a consolidated platforms for Pacific Island countries to respond to regional health impacts through uniting and strengthening research and action on human, animal and environmental health, natural resource management and Indigenous local knowledge. This emerged from a call to action at the 2018 Oceania Planetary Health Forum and continues to have resonance throughout global and regional policy fora, including the World Conference on Health Promotion, the Pacific Heads of Health meeting, in an information paper that I co-wrote with integrated programming in One Health Planetary Health, and also the Ministerial High-Level Roundtable on Biodiversity and Health at the CBD COP14. In fact, the head of health promotion at WHO recently said that Tadra Vanua was an excellent regional initiative and will shortly be promoted for World Health Day 2022 this April 7th under this year's theme, Our Planet, Our Health. It's also heartening to see that all this advocacy is paying off, as now planetary health has just been adopted as one of 7 key focus areas for the Pacific community as part of their 10-year strategic plan. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the Pacific Community is the principal scientific and technical organization for the Pacific region, which is supporting development since 1947. They're an international development organization that's owned and governed by the 27 country and territory members. So the Tadra Vanua initiative is building upon existing relevant investments by global philanthropic bodies and development aid agencies in the region, like the Wish and Rise projects, and the recent establishment of the Fiji Institute of Pacific Health Research, to lead regionally appropriate approaches to sustainable health. Tadra Vanua is an action research hub that weaves the research centres of FIPA together while networking into the most influential academic and policy architecture of the region. It will be led by the Pacific for the benefit of the region and the planet. A number of large and influential global networks that we're affiliated with have expressed support for the Tadra Vanua vision at the Oceania Hub meeting of the Planetary Health Alliance last year. And here are a group of research and intervention institutions that so far have been very supportive in many ways throughout this journey to date. We also have the in-principle support of a number of the large global and regional institutions that are major academic and development players in the Oceania region. So now for some horizon scanning. What's on the cards for the next phases of growth for Tadra Vanua? What are our long to medium term objectives and the large funding opportunities that will help shape this initiative in the region? So the Kiwa initiative, launched last year, is the first international cooperation between the European Union, France, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand on climate change adaptation and biodiversity. It's a $50 million initiative making grants for regional projects between 2 and 7.3 million Australian, and the growth of Tadra Vanua vision over the next 4 years to Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands is foreshadowed by a large grant we've now secured for a bit over Australian 7 million to extend this work of Wish Fiji to these neighbouring Melanesian countries. Our grant title is shown here, and my close colleague Stacey Jupiter will give a brief explanation in the following short video. Let me just go.
My name is Stacey Jupiter, and I'm the Melanesia Regional Director with the Wildlife Conservation Society based in Suva, Fiji. WCS and our partners are very excited to launch a new regional project under the Kiwa Initiative, which builds on work already underway in Fiji under what we call the Watershed Interventions for Systems Health in Fiji project, or WISH Fiji. WISH Fiji is taking an innovative approach to integrated watershed management that aims to improve both public health and downstream ecosystem health. We are doing so through targeted investment in nature-based solutions, as well as improvements to water and sanitation infrastructure that aim to reduce the incidence of water-related diseases such as typhoid or leptospirosis, while also reducing water quality impacts on freshwater and marine biodiversity. The nature-based solutions, such as forest and wetland protection and restoration, will also contribute to climate change mitigation while helping to maintain the ecosystem services required to adapt to climate change impacts. Through the Kiwa Initiative, we will expand the WISH Fiji approach to Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, working closely with our partners at the University of Sydney, University of Queensland, and the Columbungara Island Biodiversity Conservation Association. We will also work towards developing some novel financing mechanisms to enable long-term proactive investment in integrated watershed management in high-risk areas. We know that watershed management can be very expensive to implement while slow to yield results, so these financing vehicles will provide the platform for the sustained investment required to achieve impact. Lastly, we will also develop platforms for knowledge sharing to influence policy and practice across the Pacific and beyond. We plan to host the second Oceania Planetary Health Forum to gather like-minded professionals to share ideas, and we will facilitate stakeholder dialogue nationally and regionally through multiple approaches. We look forward to working with many people across the Pacific to tackle the difficult challenges of addressing public health as well as ecosystem impacts, protecting biodiversity, and improving our ability to respond to and adapt to climate impacts. Inaka.
So as far as funding goes, however, this is small peanuts compared to the Protecting Our Planet challenge. In September of last year, 9 funding organizations joined together to pledge $6.7 billion over the next 10 years to support the creation, expansion, and management and monitoring of protected and conserved areas of land, inland water, and sea, working with Indigenous peoples, local communities, civil society, and governments in the largest private funding commitment ever to biodiversity conservation. Through our continued funding associations with the Bloomberg Philanthropies, I was invited to be part of an author team commissioned by Bloomberg to write a white paper on how to direct investments to water quality and health innovations. And this was launched on World Water Day this year on March 22nd. So Tadra Vanua will provide an institutional home and nexus for the various One Health and Planetary Health initiatives being implemented in Fiji and the region. This is going to create greater coherence and economies of scale for technical administrative purposes. We're proposing a 10-year vision with an initial 5-year growth and proof of concept phase, and are seeking relevant partners for co-investment, co-design, and collaboration on this timely initiative. Key objectives of the initiative would include building Pacific capacity and ecological approaches to health, including public health, veterinary science, molecular research, bioinformatics, and pathogen surveillance through courses, training programs, and short courses. Build on our existing investments, such as Wish and Rise, to reach more communities in Fiji and across the region with proven interventions, and monitor the medium to long-term impacts. To establish and serve as a donor coordination hub for Pacific Planetary and One Health research and action. To lay the foundations for sustainable and innovative financing mechanisms through impact investment and private sector engagement and business case studies to provide the resources required to sustain the hub and implement phased interventions across nested scales. To develop local capacities on grant management, financial literacy and research grant administration. To develop the local laboratory capacity, to remove the need for exporting samples to Australia or elsewhere, and to support governments during surge needs like during COVID. To have Pacific-led regional and national research priority setting across multiple regional bodies and ministries. To develop these partnerships to co-mentor and supervise postgraduate students. To host and take stewardship of the biannual Oceania Planetary Health Forum, and to coax back Pacific leaders to reverse the Pacific brain drain. So I'm going to finish by reciting the first paragraph of Albert Wendt's 1976 writings entitled Towards a New Oceania. I belong to Oceania, or at least I'm rooted in a fertile portion of it, and it nourishes my spirit. It helps to define me and feeds my imagination. A detached, objective analysis I'll leave to the sociologist and all the other ologists who have plagued Oceania since she captivated the imagination of the Papalangi in his quest for El Dorado, a southern continent, and the noble savage in a tropical Eden. Objectivity is for such uncommitted gods. My commitment won't allow me to confine myself to so narrow a vision. So vast, so fabulously varied a scatter of islands, nations, cultures, mythologies, and myths. So dazzling a creature, Oceania deserves more than an attempt at mundane fact. Only the imagination in free flight can hope, if not to contain her, to grasp some of her shape, plumage, and pain. Naka, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Aaron. I think it's pretty clear that you've provided us with a real tour de force today, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity for some discussion now and more to come today and with the boot camp tomorrow. I know that you've already expressed a view that the boot camp would perhaps better be called Talanoa, using a Pacific concept, but perhaps more on that tomorrow. So questions most welcome, comments from anybody. Aaron, should we perhaps stop sharing the screen at this point? Sure. It certainly, you had beautiful slides there. It's you really feel like you're in Fiji whenever I hear one of your presentations. Becky, I can see your hand up. Please proceed.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks very much for that presentation. It was great. I'm an associate professor in law, spent the last few years at MSDI and working on some of the gender aspects of the RISE program. And I wanted to ask your thoughts about gender, because this is the kind of stuff that's been swirling around in my head, and the connection specifically to an Indigenous-led approach to planetary health in the Pacific. We know from many years of research that that women and gender diverse people experience health very differently to men. Much of the research is into health impacts on men. There are many assumptions about gender which just don't play out in practice and result in inequalities around health. We know that the impacts of climate change are unequal, and the disaster response has massively gendered impacts. So Aaron, I'm really interested in understanding from your perspective how you think the gender picture fits in with the Indigenous-led approach that your collective is taking, and how what that might look like in some of the research that you're doing, and maybe tell us about some of the things that you've been doing around gender inclusion.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really, really important point. And I think particularly in the case of water access and sanitation access and involvement in making decisions around water and sanitation, what we've been trying to do is that at the local level with communities that we're working with in Wish, is that the committees that are established by the villages or the communities, there's often a bias towards, you know, elder males, and trying to improve the constituency of those decision-making bodies within communities to be more inclusive, and to be including more youth as well. And so that's one of the kind of practical things that we've been trying to do. But I think, you know, it's going to be an ongoing thing to be trying to make mainstream the gender diversity within the decision-making bodies in the Pacific. That's for sure.
And one of the things I've been really wrestling with is the tension between respecting culture, but also observing that there are gender inequalities there, and where is the balance between trying to transform gender norms, but also respecting that there are cultural practices around gender that are very important at the same time too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thanks. Really important question, Becky. And now I can also see Donna Hannon's hand up. Donna, please.
Thanks, Aaron. Great presentation, really rich overview of the work that you're doing. I'm Executive Director of a program here at Victoria University called BU Rise, which is working with communities here in the west of Melbourne on particular problems affecting communities here in our region. So really connect with the work that you are doing. We also have a water management project that's running within that program. And so I was quite interested to hear about the WISH initiative. I was hoping you might talk a little bit more about the work of the WISH team in uptaking of those water safety and security plans for the community. So you've developed those plans. What and how are the WISH team working with communities, particularly around those initiatives that don't require financing?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. So WHO back several years ago started to kind of throughout the region try and encourage governments to be trying to get communities to establish their own water safety and security planning processes. There's been a variety of attempts to try and get that happening, and a variety of successes and non-successes in actually rolling that out in communities and training people and so forth. For example, in Fiji, they had set themselves a goal, a national goal of annually having 21 communities be trained and to initiate a year water safety and security planning processes. So we were able to assist government by getting 29 up and running. I think one of the big kind of switches in the way in which we've approached this was that while we are focusing on the immediate watersheds and the immediate water infrastructure and sanitation infrastructure of the community, we also build into that process what's going on upstream as well in the watershed, and take a bit more of an ecological perspective about what are the things outside of the purview of the immediate village and community that are affecting water quality and that are affecting, you know, flood risk and drought risk and things like that. So what that's ended up doing is that while each of these communities have their iterative water safety and security plans, they also have a feel for what's going on upstream of them as well. And what that's done is that it's fostered more community to community discussion about what they're doing upstream and what people are doing downstream. And so, so what this is kind of in effect creating are these sets of plans that are being brought together within the geophysical boundary of the watershed. And I think that kind of approach is kind of helping to foster better community dialogue and better governance of water and sanitation systems. But every individual village has their own WSSP, and so provincial government is also coming in with the various different sectors that are impacting on water quality, and they're all, you know, inputting into this plan as part of village development plans. So it's quite unique, I think, because we're really getting a lot of multi-sectoral, multi-community buy-in and involvement. So
Great. No, thanks very much, Aaron. Thanks, Donna. That might be something to follow up later. Now, I'm conscious of time. I can see a question also from Jane Wadani. So maybe in the chat box, I'll just read that one out for you, Aaron. Thanks for the fascinating presentation. I'm curious to hear some of your reflections on the roles played by academic researchers in the action research initiatives that you mentioned, I guess, alongside government, community, other stakeholders in the processes. So thanks, Jane, and over to you, Aaron, to round out the Q&A. Yeah.
Right, thank you. That's a great question. There's many roles. Some of it's just, you know, fundamental research type roles. But what I think is one of the most important roles of the researchers, both local and international, is this role of broker. So there's a brokerage role in any type of planetary health or sustainability discourse, that in order for us to have multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approaches, we need to make the time and invest in the spaces for dialogue and the spaces for brokering between different communities, brokering between different sectors, and making sure that everybody's kind of on the same page about what we're doing, and thinking about systems health, right? and the health of entire systems. And so I feel like that in the sustainability discourse, that there's not enough of this investment in and valuing of this brokerage role. So I really feel like we need to be putting more time and effort into valuing and investing in spaces for multi-sectoral discourse, spaces for, you know, multiple knowledge types to be able to be sitting around the same table and understanding each other's and empathizing for one another.
Right. Well, yeah, and thanks, Aaron. That's a fantastic way to finish today. So just maybe to close out the session, when I joined MSDI about 2 years ago, we'd always intended, Matthew French and I had discussed bringing the RISE folk together with the WISH folk to really share ideas. And there's going to be various opportunities during Aaron's visit to Monash this week. Importantly, the Talanoa event tomorrow that I know a number of you are joining. So maybe just to say as well, Aaron, we won't have time to discuss it now, but I know that you're in touch with Professor Paresh Narayan from Monash's Business and Economics faculty, and you're going to exchange further about the proposed climate change Centre for the Pacific as well. So yeah, I think many opportunities for connections. Thanks all for joining today, and we look forward to further exchange. Well done.
Thank you, everybody.